My sister demanded to walk down the aisle before me at my own wedding. It's a small favor, she deserves a special moment too, my parents insisted. I felt anger rising, but I smiled and said, no problem. At my wedding, I gave her a moment she'd never forget. I clutched the edge of the vanity, my knuckles pale as I studied my reflection. The early sunlight streamed softly through the window, bathing the room in a warm, golden glow that highlighted the bridal gown draped beside me. It was everything I had envisioned: delicate lace sleeves, a snug bodice, and a cascading train. Today was meant to be my day, yet I sensed an undercurrent of trouble brewing. A gentle knock sounded at the door. Linda. I turned to see my fiancé, Daniel, peeking in with an unreadable look. That wasn't a good sign. Daniel usually displayed his emotions boldly: joy, excitement, frustration. But now his face was an exercise in restraint. I set my brush aside. What's wrong? I asked. He stepped in, closing the door behind him. Your sister called me last night, he admitted, and a twist of dread tightened my stomach. She's coming to the wedding, isn't she? I inquired, already dreading the answer. Daniel exhaled slowly. Not only is she coming, she insists on walking down the aisle before you in a wedding dress. The silence that followed was overwhelming. A creeping horror flooded my veins, and for a moment, I nearly laughed at the absurdity. Insulting, yet heartbreakingly predictable. My sister Emma had always been my parents' golden child. If she wanted something, it was hers. If I desired it, I got what was left. And now she was trying to claim my wedding. Daniel settled on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face with a tired hand. They're siding with her. They think it's only fair since she's older and still hasn't married. My grip on the vanity grew tighter. Fair? That word has never favored me, I murmured. Taking a deep breath, I asked, and what did you say? Meeting my eyes, Daniel offered a slow, almost mischievous smile, the first since he arrived. I told him I'd think about it. I frowned. Think about it? Then he leaned in, lowering his voice. Linda, we're going to turn this situation to our advantage. I blinked in surprise. Daniel was many things: kind, loyal, protective, but his calculating side always caught people off guard when necessary. You really expect me to stand by while your sister turns our wedding into her own spectacle? He pressed, his tone sharpening. I swallowed hard. Then why not shut it down immediately? Because if we say no outright, they'll just find another way to undermine us, he explained as his fingers tapped lightly on the bedpost. But if they believe they're getting their way, we hold all the cards. A shiver ran down my spine. I recognized that determined look, the one he'd worn dealing with our overcharging landlord or a coworker ready to pin missed reports on him. It was the look of a man laying a trap. A slow smile tugged at my lips. So what's the plan? I asked. Leaning in closer, his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. We let them think they've won. We allow Emma to believe she's having her moment, and let my parents feel they're being helpful by footing part of the bill. He paused before adding, then when the day arrives, we make sure she never even sets foot on that aisle. A surge of vindication and excitement bubbled inside me. For the first time, my sister was about to learn what defeat felt like. I exhaled slowly, absorbing his words. We let them think they've won, I repeated. It was a dangerous game. If we weren't cautious, they'd trample us completely. But if we play it right, Emma will finally experience the sting of being outmaneuvered. I met Daniel's gaze steadily. All right, tell me exactly how we're going to do this. His grin widened. First, we give them just enough control to feel secure. Then we tighten our grip until they're too committed to back out. I nodded, and we both leaned back against the bedpost. They'll follow her lead. If she pushes for something, they'll push for it too. We let her push, just not in the areas that truly matter. I exhaled deeply. It would require immense patience. Years of dealing with my parents had taught me that arguing with them was futile. They could twist any situation until I was painted as ungrateful or selfish. But if we maneuvered cleverly, we could turn their own tactics against them. The next evening, I found myself seated across from my parents and Emma in the living room of my childhood home. My mother sat primly at the edge of the couch, her hands neatly folded in her lap as though attending an important council meeting. My father reclined in his chair, arms crossed and expression inscrutable, while Emma practically buzzed with anticipation, her fingers drumming on the armrest and a barely contained smirk on her face. My mother began smoothing her blouse as she said, "Daniel mentioned he's open to discussing the arrangement. Have you had time to think it over?" I forced a tight smile. "Yes." Emma brightened and I exchanged a quick look with Daniel as I played my part. I hesitated just enough to appear conflicted. I'm not thrilled about it," I admitted, twisting my hands in my lap. "But if it means keeping the peace in the family, I'm willing to make some compromises." Emma let out a soft gasp, as though she'd just been honored. My father grunted in approval. "That's very mature of you, Linda." My mother nodded. "We knew you'd see reason." Unable to hold back any longer, Emma leaned forward excitedly. "I already have a dress picked out," she exclaimed. "It won't be white, more like a very pale champagne. But it's this stunning mermaid cut that's so elegant when I walk down the aisle. People will assume I'm simply part of the bridal party. It'll be a symbolic gesture. A blessing from the older sister to the younger." I clenched my jaw until it ached. A silent thought echoed. A blessing from her, not for me. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table, a quiet reminder to hold my ground. "That sounds interesting," I said evenly. "But if we're going to go through with this, I have a few conditions." The room's energy shifted instantly. My parents tensed slightly and Emma tilted her head, questioning. "Conditions?" she echoed, as if the idea was new to her. Daniel jumped in smoothly. "Just minor adjustments. If we're making concessions for Emma, we'll need help with the extra costs. Upgrading the venue, adding extra seating, better catering." He paused carefully. "We'll need some financial support." My mother waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, that's not a problem. We want this day to be special for both of you." "Excellent," Daniel continued. "Also, since Emma will be part of the procession, we need to coordinate the dresses carefully. The photos must look flawless, so we should get our gowns from the same boutique to ensure the colors complement each other." Emma's eyes widened with excitement. "Yes, we can go dress shopping together." I swallowed my repulsion and forced a smile. "That sounds wonderful." What I didn't mention was that my dream dress was already waiting for me at a boutique 2 towns away, safely out of Emma's meddling reach. My father grunted again. "Anything else?" Daniel nodded. "We also need to book a top-tier photographer and videographer. If Emma is going to be in the ceremony, it's crucial that it's properly documented." My mother smiled. "Of course." Finally, I tilted my head slightly and said, "If Emma is walking down the aisle first, she won't be a bridesmaid, right?" Emma blinked in surprise. "Huh." I kept my tone innocent. "Well, if she's stealing the spotlight, she can't also be part of the bridal party. It would draw too much attention to one person. It just isn't fair." Emma's face twitched ever so slightly. I saw hesitation flicker across her features. She hadn't expected to lose anything in this exchange, yet she'd already claimed too much to contest now. With a delicate laugh and a flip of her hair, she conceded, "I suppose that makes sense. A small sacrifice for such a grand moment." And just like that, she was removed from my wedding party. It wasn't a major victory, but it was the crucial first step. Daniel's fingers brushed against mine once more, silently saying, "You did it." As the conversation drew to a close, my parents looked pleased, Emma appeared triumphant, and Daniel and I managed a confident facade, even though we knew we'd set the stage for their own undoing. Growing up in this family taught me one thing: never let them see you coming. As we stepped out of my parents' house, Daniel let out a low whistle. "That was something," he murmured. I exhaled, the weight of the evening pressing down on me. "I can't believe she actually thinks she's going to pull this off." Daniel grinned. "Oh, she'll try, but by the time we're finished, she won't know what hit her." The plan was in motion. Now we just had to ensure Emma, my parents, and everyone else kept believing the illusion. A week later, Emma and I stood before a boutique mirror in our respective gowns. She twirled, examining every angle of her reflection, utterly absorbed by herself. Her champagne-colored dress was far too bridal for anyone who wasn't the bride, yet I had expected nothing less. In contrast, I wore a simple, elegant white gown, not my actual wedding dress, which remained hidden and untouched by Emma's interference. "Oh, Linda," she sighed as she spun again. "I just know people will be overwhelmed with emotion when they see me walk first." It's going to be such a powerful moment. I forced a smile, biting my tongue so hard I could almost taste blood. Powerful. The only power in that moment would be her shock when she realized she'd never actually walked down my aisle. A warm sales assistant approached, asking, "Are we confirming the dresses?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. My parents are covering the cost, of course." I let out a light, almost innocent laugh. "Oh, Emma, let them spoil us a little. After all, this is a once-in-a-lifetime event." Emma beamed, convinced this was her moment. What she didn't know was that we were building her up only to let her fall. Daniel had already ensured that her dress order would never process. A few days before the wedding, she'd receive a call explaining there had been a mix-up and her dress hadn't arrived on time. And since she refused to commit anything in writing as per Daniel's suggestion, there'd be nothing she could do but scramble at the last minute. I wondered just how dramatic that moment would be. Next came the guest list. My mother had insisted on handling the invitations under the guise of making things easier for me, but her true aim was control. Daniel and I knew better than to argue, so we agreed, while secretly making a small adjustment before the final list was printed. My parents had ensured that Emma's friends were invited, people I barely knew, while some of my closest friends were conspicuously left out. Daniel discreetly mentioned this to my mother, pretending to side with her. "Linda's been so stressed," he said. "I don't think she even noticed the changes." She accepted it wholeheartedly, unaware that Daniel had already printed a second set of invitations and sent them out quietly. By the time she discovered that my friends were coming, it would be too late to change anything. Meanwhile, Emma's group would find their invitations mysteriously never arrived. There was one final deception to set up before the wedding, a risky maneuver, but one that would ensure Emma ended up exactly where we needed her on the big day. Daniel and I invited my parents and Emma over for dinner. I played the nervous bride, feigning second thoughts about our arrangement. "I just don't want any surprises," I murmured, my voice soft and vulnerable. "I know Emma wants everything to be perfect, but I can't handle any last-minute changes." Emma huffed and rolled her eyes. "Linda, you worry too much, just trust me." "Oh, Emma, I already knew you had plans to upstage me," I countered. The alternate aisle walk wasn't enough for her. She was scheming something even bigger. We simply needed to flush her out, so I took the bait. "You promise nothing unexpected, right? No surprises, no extra speeches, nothing," I pressed. Emma smirked. "I wouldn't dream of it," she replied, though I knew she was lying. We would wait and see what she planned because whatever it was, Daniel and I would be one step ahead. As they left, Daniel pulled me into his arms, whispering, "You're doing great." I exhaled slowly, steadying myself for what was to come. Everything had been meticulously arranged, yet Emma remained utterly oblivious. The wedding she thought she could hijack was never destined to be hers. Instead, she was about to face the consequences she had long earned. That morning arrived with a strange, unsettling calm. I should have been trembling with anxiety, my stomach in knots, but as I sat in my bridal suite, quietly sipping my coffee, a surge of anticipation filled me. Today wasn't only my wedding day. It was also the day Emma would finally learn what it meant to lose. The first sign that Emma's plans were unraveling came at 9:17 a.m. While having my hair styled, my phone buzzed on the table. A quick glance revealed a text from my mother. "We have a major issue. Emma's dress is missing. The boutique claims it was never ordered." I could almost taste the irony. This was the moment we had been anticipating. I took a measured sip of my coffee before replying, "Oh no, that's terrible. What happened?" Her immediate response read, "Mom, I don't know. Emma is in a frenzy. She insists she confirmed the order, yet they say she didn't. Can you call them?" I let the message linger. I wasn't about to rush to fix a dilemma that had been so carefully set in motion. 10 minutes later, another message arrived. "Please, this is a catastrophe." I finally responded, "I'm sorry, but I can't intervene right now. I'm busy getting ready for my wedding. I'm sure Emma will sort it out." I could vividly picture the scene. Emma, half finished with her hair, standing in front of a mirror and shouting at our parents. My mother frantically dialing the boutique to demand answers, and my father already suited up, pacing, and barking orders at anyone who would listen. Meanwhile, Daniel and I were exactly where we needed to be. At 10:30 a.m., Daniel received a text from his brother. "Bro, you need to see this." Attached was a photo of Emma's friends gathered outside the venue, clearly confused and angry because their invitations had never arrived. Daniel remarked, "That's odd. Maybe they got lost in the mail?" By that point, my parents must have realized something was terribly wrong. The guest list had been tampered with, and Emma's dress had mysteriously vanished. Yet they were so preoccupied trying to fix everything that they hadn't begun to put the pieces together. Then came the final crushing blow. At exactly 12:15 p.m. my father called. I let it ring, but when he called again at 12:17 I answered. "Dad," I said pleasantly. "Linda," he replied tensely. "We have a serious problem. Emma is at the venue, but security won't let her in." I feigned confusion. "What do you mean security?" he snapped, explaining that they claimed she wasn't allowed entry. I sighed and shifted in my seat. "That's strange, Dad. I distinctly instructed the venue that only invited guests could enter. Maybe her name isn't on the list." After a pause, as if he were piecing everything together, he finally said, "You orchestrated this, didn't you?" lowering his voice. I smiled and replied, "Orchestrated? You mean you set her up?" Tilting my head in feigned perplexity, I added, "Dad, I've been so wrapped up with wedding planning, I didn't even manage the guest list. Mom did." In the background, I could hear my mother's frantic voice and Emma screaming like a banshee. My father then said in a lowered tone, "Fix this now." I let out a small laugh. "Dad, I'm the bride. I really shouldn't be dealing with this right before I walk down the aisle." He exhaled sharply and I added, "Linda, I must go," before ending the call. I turned to Daniel, who had been listening intently the whole time, his face lighting up with a hint of mischief. "She's outside," he noted. I nodded. "Perfect." While I remained safe and serene inside the bridal suite, Emma was unraveling at the entrance. The security, thoroughly briefed beforehand, stood firm. "I don't care what the list says," Emma shrieked. "This is my sister's wedding, let me in." One of the guards checked his clipboard and said, "Ma'am, if your name isn't on the list, we cannot let you in. That's venue policy." Emma then turned to my father pleading, "Dad, do something." But for the first time he found himself utterly powerless. There was no evidence, no emails or written agreements, just his word against ours. "You're making a mistake," he warned the guards, yet they remained unmoved, doing exactly what they were paid to do. Keep Emma out. Inside, the music began to play. I stood at the chapel entrance, bouquet in hand, exuding calm as whispers rippled through the crowd. People had heard, people had known. Yet as I took my first step down the aisle, I experienced a sensation completely new: freedom. I was no longer trailing in Emma's shadow. This was my moment. I caught Daniel's glance at the altar, filled with pride, love, and a silent "we did it." Outside, my sister was likely still screaming, but inside I was finally liberated. As the ceremony concluded and Daniel and I were officially pronounced husband and wife, a wave of triumph washed over me. For the first time in my life, I realized Emma hadn't won. She hadn't stolen something from me or made me an afterthought. Still, I knew that the real battle was only beginning, for Emma's turmoil outside was far from over. When we eventually made our way to the reception hall, the atmosphere was electric with murmurs. Some guests had stepped outside and witnessed the chaos firsthand. Others had heard about it through the family grapevine, and even those unaware could sense the tension in the air. I spotted my parents standing near the entrance, their expressions dark and foreboding. They hadn't even congratulated me, and that wasn't surprising. I was never their priority. Emma always was. I squeezed Daniel's hand, ready for whatever came next. He grinned. "Oh, I've been waiting for this." We had scarcely reached our table when my mother stormed over. "Linda," she said in a voice that was crisp yet controlled, her eyes blazing with anger. I turned to her with the most innocent look I could muster. "Mom, I'm so glad you're here. Isn't it a beautiful day?" "Beautiful?" she retorted sharply. "You humiliated your sister." Daniel let out a soft, amused laugh. "How exactly?" "She's outside, crying in front of everyone." My mother snapped. "You set her up." Feigning deep confusion, I replied, "Mom, I really don't understand. We sent out the invitations months ago. If Emma's name isn't on the guest list, that wasn't my doing. Perhaps you should ask what went wrong." she spluttered, eyes narrowing, and I couldn't help but think the same. When security mentioned her absence from the list, my father interjected in a low, controlled tone laced with fury. "You've been playing us this entire time." The silence around us was deafening. Guests at nearby tables listened intently. My mother leaned in, her voice trembling. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Daniel smirked. "We don't think, ma'am, we know." I watched as the realization hit my parents hard. They had been deceived, their wedding funds had been misused, and every trap had been set for them. Meanwhile, Emma was left outside, utterly humiliated. My mother's lips trembled with rage while my father's face turned stone cold. Then, in a moment that felt almost perfectly choreographed, Emma burst through the doors. Gasps rippled through the reception hall. Storming in, her face streaked with mascara and her eyes swollen from crying, she was still dressed in her everyday clothes. No dress, no grand entrance, no moment of triumph, only seething anger. She marched straight toward me, hands shaking, and hissed, "You!" I offered a bright, courteous smile. "Oh, Emma, I wasn't sure you'd come." She then let out a sharp, furious laugh. "Are you serious? You left me outside, ruined my dress order, kept my friends away. And now you're here acting like I'm the crazy one." The entire room fell silent as all eyes fixed on us. My mother reached for Emma's arm. "Sweetheart, maybe we should." But Emma yanked away. "I want to hear it. I want you to admit it." I tilted my head, and in the intensity of our gaze it seemed she was saying, "You did this to me on purpose." I sipped my champagne slowly, set the glass down, and leaned forward. "Emma," I said softly, so that only she and my parents could hear, "you did this to yourself." Her breath hitched and I smiled. "You tried to seize my moment, and it backfired." Clenching her fists, she whispered, "You think you won?" I leaned back and replied, "I know I did." Daniel chuckled beside me. "You'll get over it, Emma." That was the final breaking point. In a burst of frustration, Emma grabbed a glass from a nearby table and hurled it toward me. The glass never reached its target. Daniel, as if expecting this, caught it midair. A collective gasp swept through the guests. Emma froze as my father grabbed her arm firmly. My mother looked on in horror while murmurs began. "She's lost it. I can't believe she did that. She's only embarrassing herself. It's all her own fault." For the first time, Emma's face drained of color as she realized no one was on her side. Not even our parents. Daniel set the shattered glass aside carefully and turned to my father. "I think it's best if you take Emma home." Remarkably, my father didn't argue. He nodded stiffly, grabbed her arm, and led her away. My mother hesitated, glancing at me. I said nothing. After a long, heavy moment, she finally turned and followed my father out, the doors swinging shut behind them. I exhaled deeply, and then, in the most surreal moment of my life, the entire room erupted into applause. People clapped and cheered. As Daniel wrapped his arms around me and pressed a kiss to my forehead, I realized with a sudden clarity, I was finally free. The air felt lighter now that my parents and Emma had left. For the first time, I wasn't bracing for another fight or waiting for another betrayal. I was married, happy and free, and while Emma had been exposed. The reception soon regained its energy. Guests were eager to lift the mood, and I couldn't blame them. The music resumed, drinks flowed, and laughter filled the room. I danced with Daniel, surrounded by people who truly cared about me. It felt surreal. After spending my entire life fighting for mere scraps of love and attention from my parents, I realized I had been chasing an illusion. I no longer needed their validation. I now had my own life. A husband by my side, friends who had always been there, and a family I was building for myself. My parents and Emma were no longer part of that picture, and that realization was the most liberating of all. The honeymoon flight was scheduled early the next morning. Daniel and I barely managed 4 hours of sleep before heading to the airport. As we waited to board, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. I sighed and stared at the screen. Daniel whispered, "Don't do it. Don't let them pull you back in." I knew he was right, but something deep inside needed to hear her voice, so I answered, "Mom." After a brief silence, she said, "You've really done it this time." I closed my eyes and she continued, "If you're calling to lecture me, remember, your sister is devastated." Linda snapped, "You embarrassed her in front of everyone. How could you? How could I?" I replied softly, a small laugh escaping me. Mom, are you seriously asking me that after everything she's done? My mother scoffed. She didn't deserve that level of humiliation. You should have just let her walk down the aisle. Would it really have hurt you? And there it was, the final confirmation. Even after everything, even after nearly having my wedding stolen, my mother still believed I should have stepped aside for Emma, that I should have allowed her to win, that I didn't deserve something for myself. In that moment, I finally let go of any lingering hope that my parents would change. They never would. I exhaled. You know what, Mom? I don't care anymore. After a pause, I added steadily, I don't care what you, Dad, or Emma say about me. I'm done. Linda tried to interject, but I cut her off. Standing tall, phone gripped tightly, I continued, I've spent my entire life as an afterthought in this family. I let you and Dad always put Emma first, making me feel inferior. As if I had to fight for even a scrap of your love. My mother fell silent, but I wasn't finished. This is the last time you try to take something from me. It won't work. I refuse to be manipulated again. I won't fight for a place in your family because I don't need one. Linda retorted sharply. Don't be ridiculous, we're your parents, your family. You can't just walk away from family. I smiled gently. Maybe you shouldn't have treated me like a stranger all these years. Before she could say another word, I ended the call. Daniel looked at me closely. You okay? I exhaled, and for the first time in years my answer was genuine. Yeah, I'm good. Because I wasn't sad, I wasn't angry, and I no longer craved their approval. I was free. Daniel wrapped an arm around me and pressed a kiss to my temple, whispering, Proud of you. I smiled and leaned into him as we boarded the plane, feeling an immense weight lift from my shoulders. This was the beginning of a new chapter, a new life, one where I wouldn't struggle to meet someone else's expectations, but rather, choose my own happiness. As the plane ascended, leaving the past far behind, one thing was certain. I had finally won.